Thank you all for joining today. My name is Vanessa. I am a qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions, and today I will be presenting on defending your research. Before we get started, just a few things about Statistics Solutions. We are a full-service dissertation and editing consulting company. So we are here to help students with all pieces of the dissertation, beginning at topic development all the way through to that final defense. Just to get the conversation started here today, if you guys wouldn't mind, pop in the chat. Where are you in your dissertation process? Are you at the beginning? Are you about to defend? I'd love to hear a little bit from you all. I see we have a raised hand. Go ahead, Megan.
Chat is disabled according to my.
Oh, thank you for letting us know. Sierra. Oh, I see. Okay. Sierra, it seems the chat's disabled, but I'll kind of keep going and then we can troubleshoot that. But that's very helpful to know, so thank you. Because at the end of the presentation today, we will open it up for Q&A. So if we're not able to use the chat, there should be a Q&A feature at the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen. So just to get us started, when you are defending your research, here are some general tips for getting your PowerPoint presentation ready for that defense. Again, we do provide assistance with this. So if you are someone who just wants some one-on-one time or want somebody to look through your PowerPoint or create your PowerPoint for you, we would be happy to help with that as well. But generally, your presentation should be around 20 minutes, followed by a 20 to 30-minute session for questions and discussion from your committee members. When you are working on your slides and when you're practicing, it's really great to make sure that each slide you develop, you're going through that slide and making sure you know it front to back so that you're not simply reading the slides verbatim for your committee. A lot of times it's also helpful to use less text on the slide to avoid it being too busy or too much that you're kind of inundating your listeners with information. So kind of just including those bullets, the key terms, and really the high points of your study or the information that you want to get across. And then you can just build off of those key points in your description of what you're going to be talking about. So don't feel like you have to include every single word on the slide. It's definitely okay to make those more summary in nature, just including those high points. When you start off, you will typically thank anybody who you want to thank. So that might mean your committee members, it may be your reviewers. It's typically best practice to start off just thanking the people who have kind of pulled you through that dissertation process. You might also thank your family or anybody who has been there with you throughout the program. And that can be done either at the beginning or the end of the presentation. Next, you'll start to get into your study. So you will start off, and you can think of this as really just going through your paper, right? So you'll start off with the introduction. You'll want to very clearly introduce the topic of your study, and then summarize your literature search. So identify any key findings from literature that you have highlighted in your paper or that you came across in that literature search. This is where you're going to want to provide the rationale for why you're doing your study. So it's important here to highlight areas where there may be gaps in the literature. So in going through that, you might summarize particular studies or synthesize areas where studies have researched similar constructs or similar variables or had similar findings, and then highlight what's missing in those studies to provide that rationale for why you conducted yours. Next, you will have a slide for your problem statement. So here, and also in the research questions and in the purpose, you want to make sure that you're being very consistent from your paper to your slides. So make sure that you are keeping that problem statement pretty much verbatim. You can tweak it a little bit to shorten it, but you want to make sure that there's no ambiguity or room for somebody to read your slides and say, oh, well, that really didn't match the problem statement that I read from the paper. So just be careful here to make sure that the words that you're using are conveying the same meaning. And this is kind of setting up your listeners, right? So you're saying, well, here's what's been done in the past, and here's what's missing, and this is the problem that my research intends to address. Next, you can talk about your purpose statement. So again, here you want to be completely verbatim. Exactly the purpose that you've outlined in your paper is the purpose that you want to highlight here on the slide. So you can just copy and paste that into the slide. And then you can discuss what the purpose of your study is. And then you can also go into detail about why that is the purpose of your study. Following the purpose statement, you will get into your research questions. Again, verbatim. So these research questions should match exactly what is in your paper. And I recommend having a slide per research question so that you're not putting too much information on the slides. And you may want to couple that research question with the particular hypotheses that are associated with it, if that's appropriate for your study. This is one way that you can frame these hypotheses. Again, if you are doing a quantitative study, you want to include those hypotheses on your slides. So you might present both the null and alternative hypotheses in conjunction with those research questions, or you could present your research questions first, and then following that, present your hypotheses. Next, you will want to talk about the theoretical framework that is informing your study. So a few key points you want to hit on when discussing that theoretical framework are the name of the theory, who it was developed by, what it has been used for in the past, and then how it interfaces with your study. So why is this the theoretical framework that you have decided to use? The first 3 bullets here will come from your literature search. So that's one positive of these PowerPoints. A lot of the information you need is information you already have. So you can just pull in that information, naming the theory, talking about what it was developed for, and then showing some examples of instances where it was used. And then the last point is a little bit more interpretive. So this is where you're going to be providing the rationale for why you believe this theory is most suitable for your particular study. The next section is going to go into your methodology and your research design. So here is where you are going to identify first the research method. So that is either going to be a quantitative, a qualitative, or a mixed method study. Here's where you're going to identify that. When you are identifying the method, you will also want to discuss why you selected that method. So what is your rationale behind that? And to do that, you may want to talk about the different features of that particular method. So for example, if you are doing a qualitative study, the reason that you might do a qualitative study is because your research questions are based in participants' perceptions or their feelings or their experiences. So in order to really answer those research questions, you need to get that textual data that's giving you, more information than you might get from simply numbers or, ones and zeros on a spreadsheet from your quantitative study. So when you are thinking about the rationale for both the method and the design, you always want to think back to what is the problem, purpose, and research questions that are guiding this study. and make sure you're showing some alignment between both the design and the method. Once you have talked about your research method, you will go into the particular research design. So if you selected a quantitative method, your research design could be correlational, it could be experimental, it could be quasi-experimental. Whatever that looks like for you, you will then talk about that particular design and explain why the features of that design align with your particular study. And then same thing if you're doing qualitative or mixed methods. So if you're doing a qualitative study, some of the designs that you use could be phenomenology, you could use grounded theory, you could use ethnography, whatever it is, you'll want to move from that method to design and then speak about that. And in both of those instances, you can provide some examples of other methods or designs that you considered. So you might say something like, the reason a quantitative study did not make sense for my particular research is because XYZ. So you'll just provide that rationale. And I see we do have a question. I'll be sure to answer that just at the end here. Now, once you have identified the particular method and design that's going to guide your study, you're going to want to talk about your participants and your sample size. Now, it's up to you how you want to do this. You can separate these out or you can talk about them on the same slide. Personally, I like to separate them. So reminder here, the population that the population for your study is going to be the group from which you choose your samples, whereas the sample is going to be the people that actually participated in the study. So, for example, if you wanted to conduct a study of looking at the perceptions of nurse practitioners in rural areas, for example, the population for that study is going to be nurse practitioners in rural areas, and then the sample is going to be maybe the 15 nurse practitioners who you recruited from a local clinic. So just a reminder here that the population is that large group and then the sample is the smaller group. When you talk about it during your presentation, you may want to provide some statistics for your population. So you may want to provide the demographic breakdown for that population, looking at race and ethnicity, maybe gender identity, maybe age, highest level of education. Really here, you just want to think through what characteristics are important for the listeners or the readers to know. So if you're doing a study that relates to age, well, then age is going to be very important to know. So just thinking about that population breakdown. And the reason that you are doing this is so that when you talk about your sample, your readers or your listeners will have a good idea of how your sample is matching up with your population. So this is going to help them identify, is this a representative sample? Will you be able to generalize these findings and really kind of start to make those connections? Here, you'll also want to talk about the sample size for your study. So how many participants did you recruit? Did you reach the amount that you intended to recruit? And you may also talk about any particular sampling strategies that you used. So if you used random sampling or purposive sampling, whatever that strategy was, you'll want to talk about that here. And you'll also want to provide a rationale for that particular strategy. So giving a qualitative study as an example, if you are doing a case study, and in this case study, you want to examine teachers' perceptions, it wouldn't really make sense for you to use random sampling, because if you're using random sampling, you may not be selecting participants who are teachers. In that instance, it would make more sense to use purposive sampling because you can predefine that criteria. So you are surveying or interviewing teachers. So here you'll just want to provide some rationale and back that up with citations to show that you understand the method that you used and why you used it. In the next section, and the next two sections actually, you kind of want to think of these as writing a recipe or an instruction manual. So when you're talking about your data collection, you want to make sure that it's written in a way that you're kind of holding the reader's hand. So if they wanted to replicate the study, they can go through your presentation or your paper step by step and really make sure that they are following those steps exactly. So you will want to talk about the data sources that are going to be included in your study. So if you're doing a quantitative study, that could be surveys, it could be maybe data related to more biomedical things. So maybe you're taking participants' weight, height, blood pressure, any type of vitals. That could be the data that is included. If you are doing a qualitative study, and I think this answers the question that we have in the chat, your data collection technique may be different, or your data sources may be different. So your data sources may be qualitative interviews, or a document review, or participant observations, or potentially some focus groups. So whatever the data source is for your study, you'll want to identify it here. And the best way to do this is to really list it out. So don't kind of muddle things together. If you're doing a mixed method study, first explain the data sources that are relating to the quantitative elements of your study, and then explain the data sources for the quantitative. So really make sure to separate those out. And then once you've identified those data sources, you will want to talk about the data collection technique that you're using. So again, that relates back to those interviews. Maybe you're doing a 60-minute qualitative interview with participants, or it could be a survey. So your data collection technique could be maybe you're emailing out a survey link and participants are completing that, or maybe you're doing an in-person pen paper survey. So here's where you'll just outline that. And now once you've explained the data that you've collected or you intend to collect, you are going to talk about your data analysis. So this should be done for each data source. You should have a clear data analysis plan for each data source that you've outlined on the slide prior. If you are, so first we'll start with quantitative. If you have 6 research questions, for example, you should have a data analysis plan for each of the variables in each research question. So there should be a plan for all of those things, right? So you'll want to describe. For research question 1, I intend to conduct a t-test to examine the associations between variable X and variable Y. For research question 2, I'll conduct a chi-square test of independence to determine X versus Y. So just clearly list out what that data analysis plan is for each of those research questions here. Now, if you're doing a qualitative study, that will look a little bit different. In a qualitative study, there are a few different methods that you can use for data analysis. One that I see students use commonly is thematic analysis. So if that is what you're using, you'll want to list out the particular steps that are required for that analysis. So in thematic analysis, there are 6 steps that are required. You'll just want to explain here what those 6 steps are. In this data analysis section, you will also want to talk about any software that is going to be supporting your data analysis. So you might be using Excel, or you might be using SAS, SPSS, R, maybe you're using NVivo or MaxQDA. Whatever software you're using, you'll want to mention it here in this section. And you'll also want to talk about any data preparation procedures that you had to go through. So if you are doing a quantitative study and maybe you want to take a sum of the survey responses to get a composite score, that's a really important process that you should detail in these slides so that it's really clear to your reader or your listener how you come up with the variables that you're going to be analyzing. So anything that you do to manipulate the data or to clean the data to prepare it for analysis should be discussed here. And then if you're doing a qualitative study, your data preparation might be that you are audio recording and then transcribing your interviews. If that's the case, you'll want to talk about that. And then also give some examples of how you're ensuring, and this goes for quantitative as well, how you're ensuring that that data is accurate to what was collected. So for example, if you take an audio transcript from Zoom, sometimes it is not that accurate. Sometimes the words may be spelled incorrectly, or they might pick up different words from what is said. So in those instances, you'll want to talk about the process that you went through to compare that transcript to the audio. And then the same goes for quantitative studies. So if you are doing a survey in person where people are filling it out, they're filling out their surveys, and you're kind of collecting all of those surveys at the end of that data collection event, you want to explain how you're moving that data into an electronic format to analyze it, and also explain how you're ensuring that that's being moved in a way that's making sure it's accurate. So whatever procedures you have in place, whether it's quality checks, you'll just want to make sure you're talking about that here as well. And then once you've done that, you will want to summarize those main points. So that is for just the proposal. So your proposal would go up to that data analysis section, and then you would summarize your proposed methods and your proposed analysis plan. Now, if you are a little further along in your dissertation process and you're actually defending your research, so you've already collected and analyzed your data, then you will not have this summary slide here. You will actually move on to talk about the results from that analysis. So if you're just in the proposal phase, this is where your presentation will end. And then if you are in the defending your dissertation phase, you'll go on a little bit further here. So you will not have this summary slide. And same here. So if you are proposing at this point, you can conclude, invite the participants to ask you questions, or you can move your thank you slide back here to the end. But if you are defending your full dissertation, you'll move on. So if you are defending your dissertation, you will go on to the results. So here you will want to present the results by either research question, if it's a quantitative study, or by theme, if it's a qualitative study. So I recommend breaking these into a few slides. So I would do a slide per research question or a slide per theme. That way you're not having to smush it all in one page. You will want to clearly show what the question was that you're answering, so you can kind of make that your header, and then identify any hypotheses that were associated with that question, and then you'll just present the results here. Just like in your paper, this is not where you'll want to do too much interpretation. You really just want to present what you found and then save those interpretations for later on in the presentation when you are going through the discussion. And that brings you to the discussion. So in the interpretation of the findings, you will want to talk about a few things. So the first thing you'll want to do is talk about how your findings are situated in the general body of literature. So did you have findings that coincided with previous research, or were your findings different? So maybe you found things that were completely novel. Maybe in your study, you identified new factors that are associated with a particular outcome that have not been discussed in previous literature. you'll want to highlight anything like that. So highlight where you are agreeing with previous literature, and then also highlight areas where you are differing from previous literature. Then you'll want to talk about what that means to you. So based on your content expertise in this field, what do these findings really mean? So just thinking back to the courses that you've taken in your PhD and the literature that you've already identified and discussed in chapter 2, how does this all come together for this particular field of study? Maybe it's a particular profession or a particular relationship or mechanism that you're studying. Just identify and really get creative here and talk about what your findings mean for that particular area. And then if it's applicable, you can also talk about your theoretical framework here. Instances where it may not be applicable are if you are doing a grounded theory study. So if your study is grounded theory, then you would be generating your own theory. So you wouldn't necessarily talk about an established theory, but this may be where you start to outline the theory that you've developed based on your findings. And then once you have talked about, actually, I'm going to go back one. In addition to talking about the interpretation of the findings, you'll want to talk about the implications for practice. So if you are doing a study that's related to a particular profession or really any area of study, you may want to talk about how this can be used going forward. So for example, going back to that example that I talked about in the beginning, if you are doing a study of nurse practitioners who work in rural settings, maybe your study is a qualitative study where you're asking them what are their barriers, or what barriers or facilitators do they face in meeting clients' needs. And maybe you've identified 4 or 5 barriers. This is where you'll talk about what that means for nurse practitioners and anything that you've come up with for how those barriers could be met, or how those facilitators could be expanded or improved upon. So not just talking about what you thought of the findings, but really talking about how it relates to the literature and then how it relates to the population or the sample that you're studying. So this is really the why, right? I found all of these things, but why does it matter? Who does it help? And how can we move forward with these findings and really put them into practice? Okay, then next you'll talk about the limitations of the study. So the limitations, if you have already proposed your research, a good place to start with the limitations is to go back and look at your proposal and see what are some limitations that I anticipated. Common limitations that might be cited are sample size. So in a quantitative study, you're really looking for that generalizable sample. You're looking for a large sample size. So if you weren't able to achieve that, you may discuss that here. Another limitation could be the particular design or method you used. So after you have completed your study, there may be a few things that you say, oh, you know, I think I would have done that a little bit differently if I could do it again. So those are some things that you might want to highlight here. These limitations can also be informed by your findings. So if you are doing a quantitative study and maybe you identify a novel finding, or you identify a finding that doesn't seem to make sense to you. So one example I give is, let's say you're doing a study related to smoking cessation, and it's a quantitative study. And at the end of your study, you have completed your t-tests. Maybe you've completed some chi-square tests, and you see that there are different levels of smoking cessation in different groups of people. But maybe that's where your study ended. Maybe you didn't explore those groups of people further, or you didn't explore why those differences exist. In that instance, and this also relates to recommendations for future research, you might say that one limitation of your study is that you weren't able to really identify kind of the details related to that particular variable. So here in this limitation section, always think back to the research design and the method, because there's always going to be predetermined limitations. So for example, a correlational study, in that type of study, you can't determine causation. So a lot of these elements are kind of already out there in the literature, and it's just a matter of pulling them in and applying them to your study and just providing that context with the details from your findings to kind of build around those already established limitations. And then the recommendations for practice, we discussed a little bit already, so I won't go over those again, but generally you just want to figure out how does the data and the findings that you have collected relate to or inform those people who you were studying. And then the recommendations for future research. This is where you can really get creative. So identifying areas where you would have liked to maybe make changes in your study. So with that example of the smoking cessation, maybe one way that you can really get down to the level of why those different groups have different rates of smoking cessation is through qualitative interviewing. So maybe you would recommend to future researchers that they actually go in and they ask questions about this topic and collect people's experiences and opinions and perceptions around those particular variables. And then you will typically complete your defense. Again, you can either do this at the beginning or at the end. I think it's more customary to do it at the end. But you'll just complete with a thank you and a question slide. And at this time, you would open it up for questions from your committee, which is also what I will be doing now. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And if you do not have questions, thank you so much for joining today. Again, we do provide consulting and editing services. So if you are someone who feels that you could benefit from that type of assistance, do feel free to reach out to us. We do offer a free 30-minute consultation where you can tell us about your research, tell us about areas where you might need help, and we can work with you to identify the best plan forward. And of course, after that, you'll want to include your references. But I'll open it up for questions. I did see one question, so I will answer this one. So someone is wondering, oh, thank you. Someone is wondering, for qualitative studies, can you use chart review, pre and post questions, or will this be considered a mixed method study? So to really, without knowing your study, I would say if you are collecting data that is numerical, and then you're also collecting data that is text, so words, people's statements, then you're most likely doing a mixed method study, but that is also going to rely on the type of analysis that you're using. So for example, in your question, you said chart review and then pre and post questions. I would say that chart review could be considered document review, depending on the information that you're taking from it. And then the pre and post questions, that sounds like it's quantitative. So it sounds like you might be doing a mixed method study. But again, if you'd like some more one-on-one time to talk about that, do reach out to us so we can help out. And then the analysis will also tell you if it's going to be mixed method. So if you are simply taking frequencies, it may not really be mixed methods. But if you're doing a more rigorous analysis like an ANOVA test or a t-test, then it could be. But I would say just think about if you're really collecting text data. So that could be interviews, observations, document review, things like that. Do we have any other questions? If you have correlation and regression tables, would you add them to the presentation or somewhere at the end as supplemental slides used as needed? I would add them to your results section. You should check in with your reviewer to see their preference, but you can either add the full table to your slide, or you can just add the high points to your slide and then save the full table to use in case someone asks you about it. But I think both methods are good. I would just make sure that if you don't include them in the main slide, that you just have them handy. You're welcome, Sarah. Do we have any other questions? All right, well, if we don't have any more questions, thank you all for joining. I hope to see you all in other webinars or hear from you through those consultations. Definitely don't hesitate to reach out to us.